The Texas sun burned hot overhead as Earl E.J. Jackson stepped out of his pickup truck, stretching his stiff legs before grabbing his grocery list from the dashboard. It was a simple trip, nothing more. Just some bread, milk, coffee, and the pain relief patches he needed for his bad knee. At 62 years old, E.J. carried himself with quiet authority. His broad shoulders, though stiff with age, still carried the posture of a former Army Ranger. His weathered face, marked by time and battles fought overseas, was unreadable to most. He walked toward the small-town grocery store, the automatic doors sliding open as he entered the cool air conditioning. He nodded at a few familiar faces, giving a small smile to the cashier, a young man named Malik, whose father had served in the Navy. Then, just as he was about to head to the bread aisle, he heard it. A sharp voice laced with authority, but the wrong kind. "Hey, I said, get your hands out of your pockets." E.J. stopped mid-step, turning toward the commotion at the entrance. A stocky police officer, Sergeant Paul Henderson, stood near the sliding doors, his hand resting dangerously close to his holster. In front of him stood a teenager, barely 17, his hands raised in surrender. "I wasn't doing nothing, sir," the kid stammered, his voice shaking with fear. Henderson scoffed, adjusting his belt. "Yeah? Then why the hell are you standing here like you're casing the place?" E.J. watched the teen's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. It was clear as day. The kid wasn't a threat. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story." But Henderson didn't see it that way. E.J. stepped forward. His boots thudded against the tile floor, drawing the officer's attention. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Looks like we got a misunderstanding here." Henderson turned, his expression instantly hardening when he saw E.J.'s face, and the faded army patches on his worn jacket. "And who the hell are you?" Henderson sneered. E.J. didn't flinch. "Just a man who's seen too much of this kind of thing." Henderson scoffed loudly, glancing at the small audience gathering near the checkout lanes. The whole store was watching now. "You need to walk away, old man," Henderson said, stepping forward. "This ain't got nothing to do with you." E.J. held his ground. "I don't see a crime here, just a kid waiting for someone. You really think this is necessary?" Henderson's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like E.J. "You served?" Henderson asked, eyes flicking to the patches on his jacket. 32 years, Army Ranger," E.J. said. Henderson snorted, shaking his head. "So what? You think that means something to me?" E.J. didn't react. He had faced war zones, firefights, and death itself. This man's words wouldn't shake him, but Henderson wanted a reaction. The officer stepped closer, his breath hot with arrogance. "See, guys like you walk around thinking you're better than the rest of us," Henderson sneered. "But the way I see it, you're just another washed-up vet who thinks he's still relevant." The words should have hurt, but all E.J. did was smile, and that scared Henderson more than anything, because a calm man is a dangerous man. "Officer," E.J. said evenly, "you sure you want to do this in front of all these people?" Henderson's eyes flickered to the crowd, the cell phones raised, recording. For a moment, hesitation cracked through his arrogance. Then, out of sheer ego, he shoved E.J. back. Gasps echoed across the store. E.J. stumbled, his bad knee flaring up with pain. He caught himself against a shelf of canned goods, breathing deep, regaining his balance. Henderson stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. "Not so tough now, huh?" E.J. exhaled slowly. Then he straightened, rolling his shoulders. He looked Henderson right in the eye and said 4 words. "Boy, you just messed up." And just like that, the real fight began, not with fists, but with consequences. And Henderson had no idea what was coming. E.J. didn't move. He didn't need to. He had spent decades in combat, trained in war zones, faced down men with real power, not a small-town cop who thought a badge made him invincible. Henderson, on the other hand, had no idea what was about to happen. For a long moment, the only sound in the grocery store was the hum of the overhead lights and the distant beep of a register. The crowd, still frozen in place, watched the scene unfold like something out of a movie. The teenager, the real victim in all this, stood rigid, his eyes darting between E.J. and the officer, unsure whether to run or stay. EJ let out a slow breath. His knee ached from the shove, but he refused to let it show. He wasn't about to give this fool the satisfaction of thinking he'd won anything. Then, the sharp click of a camera shutter broke the silence. Someone had taken a photo. Henderson heard it too, and the smirk on his face vanished. He whipped his head around, scanning the crowd. At least 5 people were recording now, their phones raised, the little red dots blinking. He realized too late that this wasn't the kind of situation that stayed buried. EJ saw it in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty, the first tiny crack in his confidence. But pride is a hell of a drug. Instead of stepping back, Henderson did what weak men always did when faced with a situation spiraling beyond their control. He doubled down. "You got a problem, old man?" Henderson barked, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to regain the dominance he was quickly losing. EJ finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, dangerous. "You put your hands on me," he said, "in front of all these people, in front of a camera. You sure that's a problem you want to have?" Henderson blinked. For the first time, realization set in. This wasn't some drunk he could shove around in a dark alley. This wasn't some scared kid he could intimidate into submission. This was a decorated Army Ranger who had seen more battles than he could imagine. And now, everyone in this damn store was watching him fall apart in real time. Henderson's jaw clenched. He turned toward the crowd. "Put those damn phones down!" Nobody did. EJ crossed his arms, waiting. And then, as if the universe itself had decided to step in, the distant wail of a police siren cut through the air. Backup had arrived. A squad car screeched to a halt outside the grocery store, and a second officer, Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, one of the department's senior men, stormed through the doors. He was older, worn down, the kind of cop who'd seen enough to know when a situation had gone to hell. And judging by the scene in front of him, this was one of those moments. "Jesus Christ, Paul," Reynolds muttered under his breath, eyes darting to the cameras, the stunned crowd, the kids still standing frozen near the door. "What the hell did you do?" Henderson stiffened, wiping his sweaty palms on his belt. "It's nothing, just handling a situation." Reynolds didn't buy it for a second. He turned to EJ, recognizing the steel in the veteran's eyes. "Sir," Reynolds said carefully, "is there a problem here?" EJ tilted his head slightly, considering his words. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had 2 choices. He could let this slide. He could walk away like nothing happened. Or he could make sure that, for the first time in his damn life, Paul Henderson faced the consequences of his actions. EJ straightened. "Yeah," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "There's a problem." A deep silence settled over the store. Reynolds exhaled sharply, already knowing this was about to become a nightmare. "What kind of problem?" he asked carefully. EJ stepped forward, closing the space between him and Henderson, watching as the man shifted uneasily under his gaze. "You got a cop here who thinks he can put hands on a veteran," EJ said. "Thinks he can shove people around just because he's got a badge. And I'm real curious to know what your department's gonna do about it." Henderson snapped, "You were interfering in police business." EJ turned, looking directly at every camera still recording. "That's so," he said, "because I see a kid who wasn't doing anything, and I see you roughing up a man twice your age who's done more for this country than you ever will." Reynolds pinched the bridge of his nose. He knew this was bad. Before he could speak, a woman in the crowd chimed in. "I got it all on video." He shoved him first. Another voice added, "You better believe this is going online." Henderson turned red, his fists clenching. But it was over. He knew it, and EJ knew it too. Reynolds turned to Henderson, voice low. "Paul, go wait outside." Henderson snapped his head up. "Wait, now." Henderson's face burned with rage and humiliation, but he had no choice. He stormed past EJ, shoulder checking him on the way out. But EJ didn't move, because he had already won. Reynolds let out a slow breath, turning back to EJ. "Sir, Save it," EJ cut in. "I don't need apologies. I need results." Reynolds hesitated, but he nodded. "I'll handle it." EJ studied him for a long moment, measuring the man. Then, finally, he nodded. "See that you do," he said. And with that, he turned, grabbed his groceries, and walked out of the store. The moment he stepped outside, The afternoon sun felt a little brighter, because he knew this wasn't over. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Not by a long shot. The moment EJ stepped outside, the weight of the afternoon heat pressed down on him. The sun sat lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the grocery store parking lot. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd behind him, their voices still electric from what they had just witnessed. But the show wasn't over. Paul Henderson stood a few feet away, pacing like a caged animal, his hands still balled into tight fists. He was seething, his face red, his jaw clenched so hard it looked like he might break a tooth. He had spent years bullying his way through this town, pushing people around without consequence. That streak ended today. The reality of his mistake was dawning on him, and for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. EJ walked past him without a second glance, heading toward his pickup truck, moving with the kind of steady confidence that came from knowing exactly how this would end. Just as he reached for the door handle, Henderson's voice cut through the air. "You think this is over?" EJ paused, his fingers tightening around the metal handle, then turned around slowly. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold, battlefield-worn eyes, were locked onto Henderson like a hunter sighting down a target. "You tell me," EJ said, his voice even. Henderson stormed forward a step, but Reynolds appeared out of nowhere, slamming a firm hand on his chest. "Enough, Paul," Reynolds said, his tone firm, edged with warning. Henderson's lip curled. "You're just gonna let him walk?" Reynolds exhaled sharply, glancing back at EJ. He had known the man for years, knew his history, his reputation. He wasn't some street troublemaker. He was a decorated veteran who had done more for this country than Henderson ever would. "This isn't your town anymore, Paul," Reynolds muttered under his breath. "You made sure of that yourself." Henderson jerked away from his grasp, his breath ragged, chest rising and falling with anger. But the fight was already over, and everyone knew it. And then, the real hammer dropped. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot, pulling up right behind the police cruisers. The doors opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in a gray suit. The moment his polished shoes hit the pavement, Reynolds cursed under his breath. EJ didn't even need to ask. He already knew what this was. Internal affairs. The suited man adjusted his tie, then approached Reynolds, pulling a badge from his pocket and flashing it. "Lieutenant Reynolds?" Reynolds straightened his spine, his face stiff. "That's me. Agent Thomas, Civil Rights Division," the man said. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of tone that carried the weight of men who didn't waste time. "We received a complaint about an incident involving Sergeant Henderson." Henderson's face went white. EJ let himself smile, just a little. Reynolds sighed. "Yeah, we got a problem." Agent Thomas nodded. "I'd say so. You might want to step inside, gentlemen. We have some things to discuss." Henderson's breath hitched. "This is bullshit," he barked, but his voice had lost its edge. "No," EJ said, finally speaking. "This is what happens when you think a badge makes you untouchable." Henderson whipped around, rage in his eyes. "You think you're some kind of hero, old man?" EJ took a slow step forward, his gaze never wavering. He let the silence settle between them, let Henderson feel the weight of it. Then he spoke. "I think you finally got what you deserved." Henderson couldn't hold his stare. His jaw clenched, his fist shook, but there was nothing left to say. Reynolds put a firm hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Paul, let's go." For the first time in his miserable career, Henderson had no choice but to follow orders. EJ watched as they disappeared into the grocery store, the crowd still buzzing, cameras still recording. The internet would handle the rest. He exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders finally ease. He had spent his whole life fighting battles, on and off the battlefield. Today had been no different. But this wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for every person in this town who had ever been silenced, ignored, or afraid. And Henderson, he was about to learn a hard lesson about what happens when you think you can humiliate a man who has already survived worse than you could ever imagine. EJ climbed into his truck, turned the key, and let the engine rumble to life. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the setting sun casting long streaks of gold across the pavement, he knew one thing for certain. Karma had just done its job, and it had been a long time coming. The weight of the day settled over E.J. Jackson as he pulled into his driveway, the old wooden house standing just as it had for the past 40 years. He cut the engine, gripping the wheel for a moment longer than necessary. He had fought in wars, had buried friends, had seen men break under pressure, but there was something about the fight that came after the war that never sat right with him. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel, and made his way to the porch. The rocking chair creaked under his weight as he settled in, reaching for the cigar he kept in the old tin by the armrest. He bit the end, lit it, and let the smoke roll between his lips, watching the Texas sky turn shades of fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. Then, his phone buzzed on the small table beside him. He picked it up, his weathered hands steady despite the storm he had stirred up. The name flashing on the screen wasn't a surprise. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds. EJ let it ring twice before answering. "What's the damage?" Reynolds sighed on the other end. "It's bad." EJ let out a short chuckle, taking another slow pull from his cigar. "For who?" There was a pause, then Reynolds exhaled. "For Henderson. Internal Affairs didn't just come sniffing around because of today. Turns out he's got a whole lot of skeletons in his closet, and now they're kicking the damn door down." EJ nodded, his eyes locked on the horizon. He wasn't surprised. "I figured as much," he muttered. "Hell, EJ," Reynolds continued, the frustration clear in his voice. "I've been on the force 20 years. I knew he was a bully, but I didn't know he was dirty." EJ flicked the ash off the end of his cigar. "You didn't look hard enough." Another sigh from Reynolds. He wasn't arguing. They're pulling his files now, uncovering complaints that were buried, use of force incidents that should have gotten him fired years ago. And you know what the worst part is? EJ already knew. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story." "They would have let him keep going," EJ said. Reynolds didn't respond for a long time. "Yeah," he finally admitted. "They would have." The silence stretched between them. Then Reynolds cleared his throat. "Anyway, thought you'd want to know. By this time tomorrow, he'll be suspended indefinitely. And if what IA is digging up is as bad as they think it is, he's looking at federal charges." EJ let the words settle, rolling them around in his mind. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. Reynolds spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Listen, I know we ain't always seen eye to eye, but this town, hell, the department, needed this wake-up call. You did something today, EJ. Something big." EJ shook his head, staring up at the darkening sky. "I didn't do anything, Mark. He did it to himself." A dry chuckle on the other end. "Yeah, guess so." Then, softer, Reynolds added, "You take care of yourself, old man." EJ smirked, always. The call ended, and EJ set the phone back down. He sat there for a long time, listening to the wind shift through the trees, the distant chirping of crickets filling the air. Then, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned his head just as a car pulled up. The headlights cut off, and a figure stepped out. A young man, barely 17, looking hesitant, unsure. EJ smiled. The kid from the grocery store. He stood at the base of the porch, shifting his weight, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. Sir?" EJ leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "You got a name, son?" The kid hesitated. "Elijah." EJ nodded. "All right, Elijah. What brings you all the way out here?" Elijah swallowed, his eyes flicking to the ground. I just wanted to say thanks for what you did back there." EJ studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "Take a seat." The kid hesitated, then climbed the steps and settled into the old wooden chair, rocking slightly. "You scared back there?" EJ asked. Elijah let out a soft chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, thought I was about to get locked up for nothing." EJ took a slow drag from his cigar. "Yeah, well, that's the problem, ain't it?" The kid didn't answer. EJ glanced at him. "You in school?" Elijah nodded. "Senior year." "You got plans?" Elijah hesitated. "I don't know yet." EJ exhaled, letting the smoke drift into the night. You ever think about the military? Elijah blinked, caught off guard. I mean, I've thought about it, but I don't know if I got what it takes. EJ smirked. Neither did I when I first joined. Elijah looked over at him. Yeah, but you're a war hero. EJ chuckled. Ain't nobody starts as a hero, son. You just gotta make the choice. The kid was quiet for a long moment, thinking it over. Then he nodded. EJ stood up, stretching his back, then patted Elijah's shoulder. Tell you what, you ever want to talk about it, you know where to find me. Elijah looked up at him, his eyes filled with something new, hope. I will, he said. And for the first time that night, EJ felt lighter. The battle against men like Henderson wasn't over. It never would be. But if he could make a difference, even just for one kid, then maybe, just maybe, it was all worth it. As Elijah walked back to his car, EJ sat back down, watching the stars come out. Tomorrow, the town would wake up to news of Henderson's downfall. People would talk. Policies would change. And somewhere out there, another young cop would think twice before abusing his power. Because karma had done its job, and now, EJ could rest easy. The end.